So in today's video, I'm going to give you an in-depth tour of your tubes of paint. So what goes inside them, as well as all of the information that you'll find on your packaging for your watercolor paints.
If you're new here, hi, my name is Lee Angold. I'm a botanical and natural science illustrator based in Kitchener-Waterloo, Canada. Here on YouTube, I share watercolor techniques and tips and some insights into my daily life as an illustrator. If this is content that you're interested in, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Also, if you'd like to get to know me a little bit better, I've left all of my links down below. You can also support me on Patreon, where I offer some really cool rewards, including some behind-the-scenes looks and one-on-one coaching. I can't wait to see you there.
Okay, I've got my tea and my notes, my props, and oh, damn it. I don't know how this ever comes naturally to people. Like, some people will just switch on a camera, it's all good, and that's their shot. Okay. Alright. So, notes and props and hot tea. Yeah, don't spill, don't spill. Ow. Tea's actually hot. Alright, this tea is for me, for drinking. Not because this is going to be a gossip video. There might be a tiny little bit of that, but not a lot. Mostly I just really enjoy my tea. This is a matcha latte and it's delicious. So today's video is something that I never thought I'd be the creator to make, but seems to be missing somewhat from the watercolor world. And that is just a very basic guide to how to, like, what's in your paint tubes and how to read the information on the tube. This comes up every few weeks. There's some minor drama in the pigment nerd world because somebody, whether it's a paint manufacturer who is making some strange claims, or sometimes it's a big creator who is a professional in the watercolor world and then says stuff that's like wildly weird and wrong. So in today's video, I'm going to go over what's inside a tube of watercolor paint and all the information that you'll find on the tube and what that all means. So I'm just going to go over some very basic concepts here and some very common misconceptions. And it's totally understandable that some of these things are confusing, so I'm just going to go over them and clear up some misconceptions today. So for today's video, I have enlisted help. Off screen is my husband, Jordan.
Hi, I'm Jordan.
And Jordan will be asking me some questions, which I'll be answering about the basics of watercolor paints. So in this video, Jordan will be playing the role of the watercolor newbie.
Well, that should be easy. I am a newbie.
Great, thanks. So if you enjoyed Jordan's contribution to this video, don't forget to leave a like and also comment down below and say that he should do all of my voiceovers from now on. Join the family business.
I'm not doing all of your voiceovers, Lee.
Thanks. Awesome. So, let's get started.
What are paints made of?
Okay, so paints in general, not just watercolor paints, but paints are made from a pigment, so that's the colorful stuff, and a binder, and so that can be a number of different things, but that's what makes the colorful stuff stick together and stick to your surface. And often there's some other additives that help the paint flow or stay wet for longer or dry faster or whatever.
What makes watercolors different from other paints?
What makes watercolors different from other paints? Okay, so watercolors are a category of paints. What distinguishes watercolors is that they are a water-based media, so when they dry, it's just water evaporating. And the other thing that's unique to watercolors is that their binder is re-wettable. So you can dry watercolors in a pan or on a mixing surface and then come back the next day when they're completely dry and re-wet them again. Watercolors are generally made with pigments. Now these are the same as with any other type of paints. You'll get the same general categories of, you'll get the same general set of pigments, whether you're painting in acrylic or oil or watercolor. But then what's different about the watercolor formula is the binder. So the most common binder in watercolor is going to be gum arabic. And that's a tree resin, which sticks to the pigments and sticks to the paper, but is re-wettable in water. And generally, watercolors will also have some other additives, such as honey or another humectant, so that's something that makes the watercolors re-wet more easily. And they might also have some other additives, such as oxgall, which helps them flow.
What's the difference between professional and student paints?
The exact lines are a little bit blurry, where there's a whole range of different products available. But generally speaking, you can break things up into 3 categories. So your best paints are generally going to be the professional or artist grade. So your professional grade paints are distinguished by, first of all, they don't have any fillers in them. So it's just the colorful stuff and the binder and any flow or humectant additives, but they won't have things like starch or chalk or anything. It's just the pigments. So you need to use the minimum amount to get the color that you want. The other thing that's generally true about professional grade paints is that they will list their pigment ingredients right on the tube, and they will have a larger variety of pigments available. So I'll get into that a little bit later. One step below that, you'll get student grade paints. Now, these will behave somewhat similarly to your professional grade paints, but they're often offered at a lower price point, and brands will find ways to produce a paint that's a little bit cheaper. So they'll add a little bit of fillers in, that might be a little bit of chalk or something like a starch. And so you'll still have bright colors, but they won't be quite as bright, they won't be quite as easy to re-wet. They might use cheaper pigments, so they just won't use the most expensive materials, and they might be offered in a more limited range. So right at the bottom then you have your craft or student grade paints. Right at the bottom then you have your craft or children's grade paints. So craft or children's grades paints, I'm sure we've all seen. They're things like the $2 set that you get at the dollar store, or some things that you might find at craft stores. They're really marketed to children and hobbyists. They tend to not use particularly expensive materials. They might use dyes that just fade right away. They're really just for fun. or for children where you want a really affordable product, but they might be frustrating if you're trying to layer and mix your colors and produce artwork that'll last for a really long time. Oh, hello, buddy. Are you gonna help me make my video? Come on. Come. Yeah. We have a kitty. Hey, Kidder. Hey, buddy. Thank you. I appreciate these snuggles. Time for a drink. Tea.
What does the series number mean?
Right, so often when you go into a store or you're shopping online for one single paint line, one brand, especially if it's a professional brand, you'll have a number of different series, and that'll be listed right at the top with Series 1, Series 2, Series 3, Series 4, etc. And each of those has a different price point. So within one brand, one line of paint, you're going to have different prices. And the reason for that is just the pigments that are in the paint itself. So pigments are the colorful stuff in the paint, and you can't just go to a store and say, I would like yellow. Yellow is not a thing. You need to buy a yellow substance. And so some of these substances that are used as the pigment, the colorful stuff in the paint, are more expensive than others. They're just more expensive to find or produce. Some of them are rare, they have to be mined, so they're more expensive. Some of them are very common, so they're a little bit cheaper. No, a higher series number doesn't mean that that paint is higher quality. It just means that the pigment inside is more expensive to produce. So for example, all of your cobalts, your cobalt-based pigments, those need to be mined before they're processed into your cobalt blues, etc. And so that mining process is very expensive, and so in order to get that pigment, it just costs a lot more money than it does to get a pigment like an earth color that you can just pick up that's just earth. So it doesn't mean that your more expensive, your higher series paint is better quality. It just means that the colorful stuff inside is more expensive. It's kind of like, depending on where you are in the world, oranges may be more expensive than apples. It doesn't mean that an orange is a better fruit than an apple. It just means they're different and they're more expensive to get where you live.
What is this code on the side of the tube with all the letters and numbers and stuff?
This will be the case for pretty much all professional watercolor paints and some student grade paints as well. You'll see a series of numbers. Usually it's P and then another letter or two and then a bunch of numbers. So this one is by Magello Mission Gold, and it says PR 176. And what that is it's a universal code that refers to a specific pigment. So again, the pigment is the colorful stuff, and so these are a color index, and so each color index refers to a very specific substance. So then you can know exactly what's in the tube. You don't have to depend on the name, which is something that the manufacturer makes up. So then if you're comparing between two different brands, you first want to check what the number or numbers, the pigments that are used inside the tube are, and you're going to want to match that up because that actually refers to a specific substance, whereas the name, something like rose madder, is just a description of the color, and so that could be made with anything. That is purely up to the manufacturer, what they name their paint, but the pigment that they use will give you more information.
Why do some pigments come in various shades?
Some pigments do come in various shades. Often what defines a pigment is a more general process for getting that pigment, and so there can still be some variation within that. So for example, PR101 is synthetic iron oxide, and so if you oxidize iron, you'll get a range of different rusty brown colors, but that can range from something that's very orange all the way to something that's very brown. It can range from something that's very transparent all the way to something that is very opaque. So just the pigment number alone doesn't give you the whole story, but it really does help you narrow down what it is that you're looking at.
What do these little symbols mean? This one has a little star. This one has a little bar. My, how many symbols there are.
And the other thing that you will also find often on these paints is a whole bunch of symbols. So those may be like a series of numbers or a bunch of stars, 1, 2, 3, A, AA, AAA, B, C. You might have a little square that's partially colored in, a triangle, a circle, some letters like G, NG. All of that stuff is unfortunately pretty flexible. Different manufacturers will use different systems, but the majority of professional grade paints will give you some information about the behavior of the paints inside. So the most common 4 things that you'll find on a watercolor tube, and most professional grade paints will list this either on the tube or in their line brochure, are light fastness, granulation, staining, and transparency.
What does light fastness mean?
Light fastness is a measure of how fast your paint will fade when exposed to UV light. So this is important if you're going to be hanging your artwork in a bright room across from a window. It'll get hit by the sun, and over time some colors will fade. So especially if you are going to be selling your work or hanging it up and you want it to stand the test of time, it's worth looking for pigments that have excellent or very good light fastness. Again, different brands will record this differently, so you do have to look at the brand documentation to see what their system for light fastness ratings is. A lot of them are based on ASTM ratings or blue wool scale ratings, so that's not the brand testing their paints. They are basing their rating on somebody else's tests, a centralized test, for that for the pigments that they've put into the paint.
What does granulation mean?
Granulation is a phenomenon that's specific to watercolor. So this is something that you won't see as much in other media, like acrylic or oil, or even gouache. This is something that you really only see in watercolor. Because you have little pigment particles in a very thin layer floating in water, when you have larger pigment particles or a variety of different sizes, particularly if there's a variety of different weights, they will unevenly fall down on the paper and they'll create a sort of textured pattern. And that pattern is called granulation. It's something that artists sometimes specifically look out for. It looks really neat in some circumstances. In others, though, if you're trying to paint a very smooth, detailed, realistic, shiny object, having your paint granulate out is going to be frustrating. So that's something that, for example, many botanical artists will avoid in their primary mixing colors, but might be something that you're specifically looking for if you really like that cool watercolor effect look.
What does staining mean?
Staining paper back to white. So non-staining pigments tend to be larger particles. You can pick them up and bring your paper back up to white. Staining pigments will be those that once they're down, that's the color.
What does transparency mean?
Transparency is another pigment property. So some pigments will create a very fine transparent layer so that you can see other layers of paint underneath, whereas some will be more opaque. So if I have a very opaque light color, I can paint over a darker color and you'll only see the light color. If I'm using a very transparent color, I'll only be able to get darker. In watercolor, most of your paints will have some degree of transparency. Watercolor is often considered a transparent medium, but that's not. But within that, you'll still have more opaque or more transparent pigments. Again, if you're going to be doing techniques where you're doing lots and lots and lots of layering, you probably want to be focusing on more transparent paints. If you're doing techniques where you want to be dropping some bright light colors on top of darker colors, that's where you might want some more opaque paints. So again, it just depends on what you specifically want to do with the paints.
What is a hue?
Yeah, so a hue is a word that is used to describe when a pigment or mix of pigments is used in a paint to imitate something else. So for example, manganese blue was a common blue pigment for quite some time, and then it got discontinued. It's no longer manufactured because of the toxicity of the manufacturing process, so you can't buy genuine manganese blue anymore. But most paint lines still offer a manganese blue hue, so that's made with different pigments, but they're manipulated and combined to look like manganese blue. Or the other case where hues are made is to imitate pigments that are still available but are either very expensive or toxic or otherwise difficult to work with.
Is using a hue bad?
No, there's nothing wrong with using hues. Again, if you're trying to match a discontinued pigment, it might be the only option available. Or if you're concerned about safety, you're avoiding something like cadmium or cobalt, that might be your best bet as well. It might be worth asking whether this is something that you need to replicate at all. Because again, keep in mind, these will just be made with other pigments, so you might be better off just buying those other paints. But that's going to be context specific, depending on exactly what it is that you're looking for. There's all kinds of reasons why paint manufacturers might make paints with multiple pigments in them. So the most obvious one is cost savings. They don't have to stock all of the colors, all of the different pigments, if they can make, instead of having a bunch of yellows and a bunch of greens and a bunch of blues, they can mix some of their greens from their blues and their yellows. So then they just don't have to have as many pigments in stock, and they can choose cheaper ones. Another reason is the specific concept of convenience mixes. So some shades or properties of paint aren't really available as a single substance. So for example, there's just not a huge range of green pigments available. If you want a paint that's a really nice, natural looking, attractive green, your options are very limited. So what ends up happening is you'll get a convenience mix, which is a mix of a blue or green paint and something like a yellow, to make something that looks like more of a traditional natural green.
If a paint contains multiple pigments, will it be muddy?
The short answer here is no. You can have a mix of a bunch of different pigments that will mix perfectly cleanly. However, if you have two or more pigments that have very different behaviors, like you have one that's granulating and very heavy, and one that is light and staining, they're going to separate out, and then you're going to have a separation effect. So you'll see this in some special effects paints. And sometimes this is a desired effect, but the problem is if you try to start mixing that again with something else, you're going to, the pigment interactions are going to be more and more unexpected, because you're going to have all sorts of different ratios of different things that behave different ways. So it's easier to predict if each of your paints behaves a certain way, how they're going to behave when they mix. Whereas if you've already mixed them, and then you mix them again, and you've got all different pigment properties, you might end up with some surprises. And sometimes those surprises are beautiful, and often those surprises are not exactly what you were going for.
If a paint contains multiple pigments, will it be less light fast or less permanent?
Okay, this is an annoying thing that actually some paint manufacturers have started spreading, where they say, oh, our paint is better or more light fast because it only contains one pigment per tube. That's nonsense. That's you're going to be mixing your paints anyway on your paper. So hopefully they aren't reacting with each other. So the only case where mixing more pigments in would make something less light fast is if you're mixing non-light fast pigments. And that's all that there really is to that. You can mix as many pigments as you like. That shouldn't affect your light fastness.
How can I compare paints from different brands?
Yeah, I do prefer to stick mostly to single pigment paints, but that's not because of the paints themselves. It's because I buy from a wide variety of different brands. So I shop across multiple professional brands, and I find that easier to keep track of what I have in my palette and fill in the blanks if I'm using specific pigments, because then I can just go and buy that pigment from another brand. If you would like to do the same, I've made a gigantic spreadsheet of all of the single pigment paints available from a huge range of different professional grade brands. I'll leave the link down below in the description for this video. You can go check it out, and it's really helpful if you'd like to replace a paint that you have with something from another brand. You can compare across brands by pigment. That is a very interesting question. Paint is not a particularly heavily regulated industry, so you are definitely going to come across some brands that make claims that don't hold water. That being said, for most of the larger professional watercolor brands, I would say trust but verify. Most brands are pretty good about listing pretty honest contents in their pigments and doing their best to give you some kind of light fastness and property information on their tube. There are a few notable exceptions. So actually the reason I made this video was the latest hot gossip, the latest tea. Is Daniel Smith and their Primatech line. They list as their pigment information on the side and across the front. They have these genuine minerals, so they'll say genuine or green apatite genuine or jadeite genuine. And they have recently sort of skirted around the issue of admitting that in addition to those paints, in addition to those listed gemstones, the majority of the paint is actually some synthetic, the majority of the paint is some cheaper synthetic or other mineral ingredients. And they don't list those at all. So in that case, you can't really know what's in those tubes. There's a few other examples. My Mary Blue is generally considered a good professional grade brand, but they label all of their paints as 3-star light fastness, which is their highest. They don't have any variation within their line, and they absolutely, some of those pigments should be ranked lower, but they say all of their paint is extremely light fast. You know, you're gonna have to check on that for individual pigments. My general feeling is trust but verify. I'm sorry, you're hearing a cat shredding something. Yeah. So another thing that you are likely to find on your paint tubes, it does depend a little bit on where they were manufactured, but you'll have an ASTM standard, ASTM 4236, and there will be a seal or a bunch of words describing how it meets the standard. So either it will be non-hazardous, or there will be an AP seal, or it'll say non-hazardous, and that means that it's doesn't have any special handling requirements, it doesn't have any known toxic substances in it, or it will have a CL seal, which means it is safe to use as a paint, but it needs to be handled according to certain care instructions. And so those are fairly simple in the case of paint. They boil down to do not eat. But that's just a little bit more complicated when you take into account that artists, I know that I'm guilty of this, occasionally lip point their brushes, or accidentally dip their brushes in their coffee, or accidentally drink from their water jar. So you do have to be careful, and also don't give anything that's got a CL seal to children under 10 or people who might not understand the proper care precautions. And then when you are painting yourself, particularly if you know that you have a pattern of being a little bit absent-minded and drinking from your paint water jar, just be careful with those pigments.
What won't I find on the pigment tube?
So there's a few things that manufacturers don't necessarily need to report on their paint tubes. So the industry standard is they don't need to report certain opacifiers. So, for example, some things like your manganese blue hues will often have some additional opacifiers, like a white pigment added in to make them a little bit more opaque, and that's not required to be reported. Occasionally, brands will add a neon pigment to a paint to make it really vibrant. Mostly in professional brands, they will report it or at least give you a lower light fastness rating so that you know that it's there. But technically, it's not required to specify which neon dye is added in. So you don't necessarily know exactly what that is. You won't necessarily know some brand-specific behaviors. So, for example, core watercolor will tend to spread across the page because of synthetic oxgall, so it will say what they're using.
If you learned something new in today's video, let us know down in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll be notified when the next video comes out.